My name is Lee Moore, and this is another Robless episode of the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob will be back with us on the next episode. That's in 2 weeks. Today, I'm going to dive in by myself on a poem by a guy who some of you may have heard of. Hang on, let me look back at the script and see what his name is. It's Mao Zedong. You may have heard of Mao. Mao was a kind of important figure in Chinese history in the 20th century. He actually was also a quite well-known poet. Poetry was never his main thing, but it was one of the ways that Mao, who, just to make sure everybody knows this, I'm almost certain that everyone listening to this podcast knows this, but just in case, Mao was, of course, the Hunanese leader of the Chinese Communist Revolution, took control of China in 1949 and led it to the end of his life in 1976. Some good years in there, probably more bad years. In trying to cultivate this image of an emperor-like figure, he oftentimes wrote classical Chinese poetry. And today, we're going to be looking at one of his poems. It was published in the People's Daily on June 30th, 1958. That's the very beginning of the Great Leap Forward. It is a celebration of the elimination of a nasty parasite, the blood fluke, from the entirety of Yuzhang County in Jiangxi. It is a parasite. It does some nasty things below the belt. The poem alludes to one of those side effects. The party, the Communist Party, when it took power in 1949 of the entirety of China, it took the medical health of the Chinese people quite seriously. That was a key component of it maintaining its legitimacy, and it was serious about getting rid of these blood flukes. At the time, there was an estimated 12 million people who were infected with blood flukes, mostly in the southern part of China, so from the Jiangxi south, and 100 million people were at risk of getting blood flukes. Mao created a leading small group dedicated only to dealing with blood flukes. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with the terminology, a leading small group, or sometimes just called a small group, is an ad hoc group within the party that tackles a specific problem. So to have a leading small group dedicated specifically to blood flukes meant that blood flukes were a really big deal as far as Mao was concerned. In 1953, the CCP, that is the Chinese Communist Party, sent more than 100 medical workers to Yuzhang County to deal with the blood fluke epidemic. They healed more than 1,000 people. In a meeting on February 27th, 1956, Mao made a speech saying he wanted to prioritize the blood fluke problem. And eventually it worked out. In 1958, they got rid of all the blood flukes in Yuzhang County, and Mao was so happy that all night he could not sleep. The very next morning, he composed this poem. The full title is Two Poems Composed in 7-Character Lines, Sending Off the God of Epidemics. And I'm going to read both of these poems. I'll read the first one and discuss it a bit, and then I'll read the second one. China's green waters and the blue mountains are so numerous, but even the great ancient Chinese medical theorist Hua Tou is unable to take care of this tiny little worm. The 1,000 villages are covered in vines and peppered with their leaking poop. The 10,000 homes are abandoned. Only ghosts sing inside them. He sits on the earth every day and walks 80,000 miles. He roams through the heavens and looks out the distance at the 1,000 rivers. China's Orion constellation desires to ask the God of Epidemics about it. Happiness and hopelessness are all the same as time twists and turns. So a couple of things about this poem. First off, the poem is about Wenshen, that's the God of Epidemics. This is this folk god in Chinese mythology who wanders around the earth causing epidemics. This poem essentially shows him, the God of Epidemics, in old China. You've got China's green waters and China's blue mountains, and the God of Epidemics is wandering around killing a bunch of people. That's what it means when the poem says he sits on the earth every day and walks 80,000 miles. He roams through the heavens and looks out the distance at the 1,000 rivers. That's the God of Epidemics roaming around, causing havocs, causing people to get sick, causing people to get diarrhea is what it actually alludes to. So this first poem, it's about how hopeless things were in old China. Even that last line, happiness and hopelessness, are all the same as time goes by. I had trouble translating that because it feels very much like this kind of cyclical nature, like you're stuck in a rut and you can't get out of it. And I didn't know how to stay faithful to the original while trying to communicate the original's intent. But there's this sense that old China is stuck in a rut and it can't get out of this cycle of epidemics that's being caused by the blood fluke. Now here is the second in this pair of poems. A spring wind blows through 1 billion poplar and willow branches. The 600 million Chinese of today live like the sage kings of old, Yao and Shun. Showers of red petals and our fulfilled hearts have been translated into waves. The green mountain has carefully been transformed into bridges. High up, the people are using their silvery hose to dig canals. Down low, they are using their iron biceps to shake China's 3 great rivers. May I ask, old man epidemic, where will you go now? Maybe you can have the light from the superstitious paper money that the people used to burn to light your way out of here. As usual, I'm going to put the translation along with the original up on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. The second poem is interesting because it shows how Mao imagines his new China, the post-1949 China, the post-communist victory China. One thing that really struck me about this poem is how much nature is being conquered. If in the first poem you had the Chinese people as victims of nature, the God of Epidemics is doing things to them. Here, the Chinese people are the ones who are doing things to nature. They're turning green mountains into bridges. They're making these canals. They're shaking China's 3 great rivers. And they're sending the God of Epidemics off out of China. The way the poem in that line 7 and 8 does that is actually kind of interesting. It's sort of ironic. They're shooing away old man epidemic. They're saying, essentially, how will you see to get out of here? Maybe we can use this other superstition. The superstition they're referring to is something called 支船明烛. So that literally means paper boats and candles used for funerals. It's a part of a folk tradition. I believe you burn them at the funeral to send off the dead. And so here, Mao is employing them ironically because you've got one superstition that's helping another superstition get shooed away from China. Classical Chinese way, it's kind of funny. Which brings me to a larger question that I had when reading this poem. What is the relationship that Mao has to the past, at least in terms of this poem? Is old China good or is it bad? Obviously, to a certain degree, it's bad, because old China is the old China of Hua Tou, the traditional Chinese medical practitioner who couldn't solve the blood flu problem. Mao is making fun of old China. He's saying lots of the things that happened in the past, those were silly, those were dumb. He's making fun of old China. He's saying it could not solve the problems that the people needed it to solve. So you've got Hua Tou. He is being made fun of. You've got the God of Epidemics. He's being made fun of. You've got this superstition with the paper boats and the candles for funerals. That's been being made fun of. That's being ridiculed. But it's not entirely meant to ridicule ancient China. The figures of Yao and Shun, which are in this poem in line 2, are interesting because they are pretty much the earliest thing you have in Chinese mythology. There are a few earlier myths, but Yao and Shun are the guys when you talk about models for Chinese rulership. Chinese mythology claims that these were real kings, but they're almost certainly mythological. They're not real, but they're the people that everybody in Chinese history points to as the great kings. You want to be a good ruler, you have to be like Yao. You have to be like Shun. Even Wang Anshi, in some of his discussions that he had with his emperor Shenzong, talked about Yao and Shun as models of how a good emperor should rule. So this is not an entirely critical perspective on the ancient Chinese past, but it mostly is. I don't know really what to make of that. Mao is famous for having once said, we can essentially get rid of all this old stuff, all these old antiques. We don't need them anymore. But he understood Chinese history. He read a ton of Chinese history. Now, before we finish, I mentioned last week that this was sort of mini-series, that the Wang Anshi poem I did, I guess not last week, but 2 weeks ago, was something that Mao was going to allude to in this poem. Mao alludes to Wang Anshi in the first line of the second poem here. A spring wind blows through a billion poplar and willow branches. That line is pretty close to a line in Wang Anshi's poem that I did 2 weeks ago. And I'm also struggling with what to make of that, because there is this kind of Dante-esque sense. Wang Anshi is lost in this labyrinth of billions of poplar and willow branches, and his thoughts are just kind of running together, and he can't find his way out of these thoughts. But for Mao, this allusion to Wang Anshi is actually done in a pretty positive way. Mao puts this at the beginning of the second poem, that is the happy poem, the poem of China in 1958, where things are hunky-dory because the communists are in charge. I don't know what to make of this. Mao, I think, respected Wang Anshi. He wasn't entirely uncritical of Wang Anshi, but he did respect Wang Anshi. And so here we've got him deploying a line from a Wang Anshi poem in his own poem, but he's doing it in a totally different way. What does that mean? Well, honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's best to just leave this podcast with a bunch of question marks, because the best literature is the kind of literature where you never really know what the right answer is. All right, I'm Lee Moore, signing off, saying, 难舍难分. That's just a Chengyu that means I'm loath to part from you. It's been a blast. Thanks for coming to the podcast, and until next time, 再见.